So the subject this evening is Floodplain Meadows. It's an area I've been researching for the last 30 years. It's becoming increasingly topical as ecosystem services rises to the top of more people's agendas. These meadows really are multifunctional and can offer all sorts of benefits where they're restored. This isn't so far away from you. It's in Wiltshire on the River Thames up near Swindon, Cricklade North Meadow, which is well worth a visit in a normal year at exactly this time. So I chose to put the slide up because this is the end of April. And there you can see a floodplain meadow in full bloom. And this is the Snake's Head Fritillary. And they estimate there are more than 1 million of these on this one meadow. It's the majority of the British population of this species just in one field. But this year is not the year to go because it's been so wet. I think last week it was still more than welly deep. So, and then this is a similar community in the summer showing some of the diversity that occurs. I thought we better start off with a definition of the word meadow because that has become so widely used now. It's in a way losing its meaning because it's been applied so generally. But the word meadow itself comes from the Old English to mow. And so a meadow is a mown grassland. If the grassland isn't mown, just grazed by animals, then it's a pasture. All sorts of wildflower mix companies now sell you meadows that is full of often cornfield annuals, which are something else altogether. I'm using the term meadow in its stricter form, a grassland that's cut at least once. Sometimes you can get 2 hay crops per year, and it may or may not be grazed with animals afterwards. So they're of great conservation value for their plant community, one of the most diverse in the UK with up to 40 species per square metre, but they're also of interest for other benefits, such as ground nesting birds. Here we have redshank that still has a stronghold on the Somerset levels in the floodplain meadows. They're down on the levels. Skylarks are a frequent visitor. Curlew are particularly connected to meadows, and they still are hanging on along the River Severn and some of the Midlands rivers. There's a wide range of interest in terms of nature conservation, but as I mentioned at the start, also in terms of ecosystem services, and that's what I'll introduce as well. But the key thing is a meadow is a system that needs to be managed, and that's particularly true of floodplain meadows because they sit on a river floodplain. They receive nutrients every year from the river, and therefore they're very productive. And if they're not managed regularly, the competitive plant species take over and you quickly lose the diversity. So here are some photos of management in action, the hay being cut. One of my colleagues standing next to a haystack. You can get 5 to 6 tons of hay per hectare, so they're very productive. And then a cow eating what's called the aftermath growth. Again, and aftermath is an Old English word, math being the harvest. So aftermath is what then regrows, and that's typically what is grazed. And as I mentioned, up to 40 species per square metre, so they can rival chalk grassland in terms of their diversity. And here we have the most characteristic species of a floodplain meadow is the great burnet. So those deep crimson flower heads is actually a member of the rose family, but you have to have very good eyes to see the structure of the individual flowers, but they do look like tiny roses. Very long-lived plant. There are estimates that some individuals are hundreds of years old. It moves sideways clonally, and so you can sometimes find distinctive clones within a meadow. And it is perfectly adapted to flooding. So in summer, if you get an unexpected flood in the middle of summer that may cause the soil to become anoxic, and plants really struggle to grow then. So it may lose its entire above ground canopy during a long flood, but can bounce back incredibly quickly as soon as the flood disappears. So this same species is found on all the major rivers of Northern Europe, all the way from Western Siberia through the Baltic states, Poland, Germany, Netherlands, and here, and in a few rivers in Ireland. Basically, the same community occurs throughout that area, and historically, they've all been managed in much the same way because hay historically is such a valuable crop. This is a map of the areas that still hold this classic floodplain meadow community, often dominated by the great burnet herb and with the meadow foxtail as the main grass. So you can see they form a very distinct pattern through the Midlands of England. So not quite getting down into your patch in Hampshire. And we think the reason that they're restricted to this Midlands area is a historical one in terms of the Enclosure Acts. These Midlands areas were the last to be enclosed, and so common grazing persisted for the longest. And these meadows typically were grazed in common by everyone in the parish. Typically, people drew lots to cut the hay, and then everyone was allowed to turn their animals on after Lammas Day in August. So we think they're missing from the south and southwest, and from East Anglia, and from the northwest, and these were all areas that were enclosed at a different time. So we think meadows did previously exist there. So many of your floodplains probably did support meadows, but because they were put into private hands at an earlier stage, the land use has changed. But another important fact up in the top right there is the total area of this particular plant community is less than 1,500 hectares. I think our latest estimate is about 1,200 hectares, which is smaller than Heathrow Airport. So although some of these are quite big red circles on the map, and the size of the circle does reflect the size of the site, but they're not entirely to scale. So you can fit all those 100 meadows into Heathrow Airport. So it's gone from being one of the most abundant land uses in the country to one of the rarest in a period of perhaps 80 years. So another shot of the site at Cricklade North Meadow, with the fritillaries in bloom again. But I'm using this photograph to introduce the idea of community patterns within a field. So this meadow is over 100 acres in extent. It's all managed uniformly. It's alongside the River Thames and the River Churn, which flood intermittently. But what you can see on this photo is a very distinct change in plant community. So there's the purple and whites of the fritillaries, then an area dominated by the marsh marigold or kingcup, the big yellow flower in the center of the photograph. And then moving in front of that, you can see the darker green, which is mainly the spike rush, and the big sort of shiny leaves in there are the curled dock. So the three distinct plant communities in that one picture, even though it's all on similar soil, it's all managed in the same way. So what's driving the pattern we can see? And that's really why we got interested in these systems from our ecological point of view. And what we've shown is it's the hydrological regime, how wet the soil is. And what's driving the pattern we can see here is just a very subtle change in the elevation of the surface, and therefore how close the ground surface is to the water table. So the fritillaries, although they only occur on floodplains, they actually like quite well-drained soils. So they're on the slightly higher bits. The marsh marigolds are the intermediate level, and the spike rush is on the lowest lying bits that tend to trap floodwaters and hold them a bit long. But the difference in terms of elevation of the soil is only across that whole site about 40 centimeters. So it's very subtle changes cause big changes in the plant competitive interactions. So we've been doing detailed quadrat surveys. So here we're doing a population count of the fritillary, and not only counting the flowering plants, but finding the seedlings too, trying to understand how the populations fluctuate and what drives them. And we've discovered that they're very adaptable to flooding conditions. If they try to grow their roots in October, typically, and if they find the soil is saturated, they just make a decision to stay dormant for a year and wait for the following October and start again. And some research we've done on the Hereford meadows suggests they can stay dormant for 3 or even 4 years if the conditions are consistently unsuitable and still come up in the 5th year and flower. So, as I mentioned, we're interested in the hydrology of these systems, what their relationship is with the river, how, if you make changes to the river, either installing or removing weirs and sluices, dredging them or changing their plan form, you change not only the hydrology of the channel itself, but also of the floodplain. And so many of the questions we're asked are to investigate what happens when river engineers get involved and alter the river. And so some of the techniques shown here, the theodolite on the tripod is measuring the soil surface to a few millimeters in resolution, because just a couple of centimeters can make a difference to which plant community you get. In the middle, a colleague is installing a dip well, augering out a hole which we line with a plastic tube and then monitor the water table height through the year. In the bottom right, I think that's me actually measuring an older dip well with a graduated stick, but there are automated ways of doing that too. And then looking at river gauge boards to understand how the river level is affecting the water in the field. So we've looked at a large number of sites in terms of how the water in the watercourses, ditches, rivers surrounding a meadow affects the water table beneath the meadow, and then how the vegetation reflects that pattern. It looks like we haven't actually got one inside Hampshire. We have one on the River Avon, just south of Salisbury, and we have one on the River Loddon, but just over the border into Berkshire. And these are the sites that we've built up our knowledge of how individual species and then whole plant communities respond to the soil water regime. And all the data from 68 sites across both England and Wales, over 30,000 quadrats, that's 1 by 1 square meter frames, as you saw in an earlier photo that we put down, and record all the species that occur within that square meter. So we have a huge botanical database. We've made it available to the public by the European Vegetation Archive. Researchers around the world can draw on it. We recently published a paper showing it was the biggest data set of repeated measures, because we quite often return to the same spot on the floodplain to see how the vegetation is changing from year to year. It was the biggest data set in Europe of botanical data from repeatedly measured points. So as well as all that botanical data, we have hydrological data from models of these meadows, where we feed in the met data, the soil data, data of levels in the surrounding watercourses, and simulate what the water table is doing under the entire site. Then on top of that, we look at some of the chemistry in terms of nutrient availability in the soil, and also the nutrient content of the tissues of the plants to look at nutrient budgets. As I said, we started the work in the Somerset levels, but are now nationwide. And just one example of the sort of information that is generated by this, looking across multiple sites we simulated the water regime. We then measured how many weeks in the year was the soil drying out, how many it was waterlogged, and then plotted this sort of graph of we call it the hydrological niche. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you have soil that is stress-free, that it's just nicely moist throughout the year, while in the top left, you have soils that are waterlogged for a lot of the time, and in the bottom right, soils that are dry for a lot of the time. And then in that niche, we look at which species occur where, and you get a neat pattern for quite a few groups of species, but this is one that most people can relate to. It's the 3 common buttercup species that you find in grassland. What's of interest is just how nicely they segregate themselves. So this is natural selection in action. The creeping buttercup is specialized to cope with waterlogged soils. It's quite happy when there's no oxygen in the soil because its roots can actually snorkel and send oxygen down to keep them alive. And so it occupies areas that are regularly waterlogged, whereas the bulbous buttercup has done the opposite and has specialized in coping with drought, so that it quite often sheds all its leaves by midsummer and just rides out dry periods as a bulb below ground. So that tends to dominate in areas that regularly dry out. And then the meadow buttercup occupies the area in between the low stress environment because it's much the biggest, tallest of the 3 species. So where conditions are good, it can outcompete the other 2 and dominate. But when the stresses become high, it tends to give way to one of the others. And we can draw similar diagrams of the rose family, of sedges, and they all show this same phenomenon of having divided up hydrological space between them. So think more broadly now, in terms of ecosystem services, what can floodplain meadows do for us? So if I start in the top right with flood risk management, meadows have the advantage of being able to tolerate floods at any time of year. And therefore, if you reconnect your river to the floodplain to allow the floodplain to store the water after storm events, floodplain meadows are a useful land use type because they tolerate that uncertainty and can produce a crop no matter if you get a flood in winter, a flood in summer, neither of those or both of those. Whereas pastures that are more intensively managed and maybe full of something like the ryegrass, which will simply die if it's kept underwater for too long and is very unproductive if the soil's very dry. So although farmers like ryegrass because it can be so productive when conditions are good, it's not ideal for floodplains because it suffers when the hydrology goes out of its tolerance range. So meadows are good for connecting rivers to their floodplain and therefore giving some flood risk management advantages. And for a similar reason, they're good at improving the water quality because if rivers are allowed to spread out over their floodplain, the water slows down, the sediment is dropped, and so the service below sediment trapping occurs, taking sediment out of the rivers, and it also removes a lot of the nutrients, hence the water quality improves because of that sediment being trapped. And then the plants in the floodplain meadow can use the phosphorus, the nitrogen, etc., that is associated with the sediments and turn it from being a problem, which it is when it's in a river, to a benefit, which is what nutrients are when they're locked up in hay. Which brings us to the next one, productivity. They are productive systems because primarily the nutrient they're trapping from the river and the moist soils that tend to occur for longer in floodplains than other parts of the landscape boost the hay yields. And hay has fallen out of popularity amongst farmers. They prefer to make silage. But that equation is beginning to change now because silage is very hungry in terms of artificial fertilizer application, where hay can grow itself with absolutely no inputs. So if you're trying to de-intensify your farm, then hay is a useful product. If we carry on moving around, cultural and aesthetic values, floodplain meadows are a lot more attractive than some alternative agricultural land uses. In many cases, there's good documented histories of the same site being managed annually since doomsday. So I did a little calculation for I think the site at North Meadow where we were looking at the fritillaries. If you consider how many person days have gone into producing that meadow, it was recorded as being there in exactly the same place in doomsday, and the records held by local manors show that it's been managed constantly as a meadow ever since, where people were paid to go out and clear the drains and people were paid to manage the stock on the site. So the number of person days involved over the past 1,000 years is probably more effort to create that artifact of our culture than was used to build the pyramids. So I think it's important these sites are seen as cultural artifacts and appreciated for the amount of effort that's gone into creating what we see today. Then moving around, biodiversity. So you get this incredible plant diversity, but that underpins very high invertebrate, particularly the pollinator diversity, very interesting soil diversity too. And then the bigger taxa such as birds and mammals and amphibians also use the meadows. And then the final one, which has moved up the spectrum of interest recently, is carbon sequestration. Floodplains tend to have very deep soils. They're alluvial soils made up of past sediment deposition, often several meters thick. And as we'll see in a moment, many of the species growing in the meadow root deeply through them. And grassland communities are particularly good at pumping carbon below ground and storing it in the soil. Around the world, the most carbon-rich soils are often grasslands. They're more effective than trees in that respect. And we've recently been looking at the amount of carbon sitting under these floodplain meadows. And quite often, you find you get more carbon per square metre on a floodplain than you do in a peat soil. We're struggling to get that recognised by the government schemes, which have become so obsessed with planting trees and conserving peat that they've overlooked, particularly grasslands have been completely overlooked, when in fact they might be the richest store of carbon and the area of greatest potential in terms of storing more carbon. Okay, but just to say a few more words about nutrients in meadows, because this explains a lot of their history. If we start in the top left and think about the catchment as a whole, the rocks gradually erode and produce sediment and dissolved minerals in the river, carried downstream, and those are deposited on the floodplain every time there's a storm event that causes the river to come out of its low flow channel and spread across the floodplain. So floodplains, for that reason, are nutrient rich because they're receiving this annual top up from the river. And so historically, medieval farmers understood that very well. Well, meadows started back in Roman times, and it was well understood that it was the floodplain where you could make hay every year, year in, year out, and get a good harvest. If you tried to do it on other parts of the landscape, you would deplete the nutrient pool and your yields would dry up after 5 or 6 years. Floodplains were almost uniformly put down to meadow for this reason. The plants are drawing up that nutrient that's been deposited by the sediment, and people exploited that by making hay that they would have fed to their stock over winter, and also by grazing sheep in particular through the autumn and winter. And how they then use that nutrient was by taking the farmyard manure generated by cattle and spreading it on their arable fields, but also something called the sheep corn system, where they would let sheep graze on the meadows during the day and then drive them up onto the arable fields and fold them there overnight, where they would drop a lot of their muck. And those were both methods of moving the nutrients out of the floodplain up onto the arable fields so that you could get an annual crop of wheat, barley, oats. And then all of those various routes would end up feeding the local human population. There seems to be, looking purely at the doomsday data, quite a strong correlation between the amount of floodplain meadow a parish had and the size of its population. What we can't say for sure is which way the causal relationship works, whether the human population was limited by the amount of food that it could generate and that the meadows were central to doing that, or whether the amount of meadow it could manage was limited by the population of the village. But there's clearly a relationship between those two things. So just to how we explore this sedimentation event, this is rather a grashy looking photo compared to the ones I've shown earlier when it was in flower. This is early spring, sort of February, March time, before the grass has really got going. And this is following a big flood event. And so much of the grass you can see in the foreground there has been buried in sediment. Those of you with keen eyes can spot little mats. So there's a cane in the middle, and there are three what we call sedimats dotted around that have been pinned to the ground to collect the sediment. So they're basically bits of astroturf that are designed to replicate the roughness of the surrounding grass and to collect a representative sample of the sediment that falls out of the flood. So we leave them on the ground until there's a flood, then we go back and collect them up, dry them off, brush the sediment out of them and weigh it and analyze to understand how much nutrient is moving in that way. So these are some data from Cricklade North Meadow again, 4 different plant communities. For those of you not familiar with the National Vegetation Classification, MG5 on the left is a dry meadow. MG4 is the one we've been looking at with the Great Burnet. MG7C is a rather grassier version of that. And MG13 is what's called an inundation grassland that sits underwater for much of the spring. So basically, as we move from left to right, we're getting wetter vegetation types. And we've looked at the amount of phosphorus in kilos per hectare that fell on these different plant community types in one particular year. And you can see that it's a lot of variation, but the amount falling on the wet vegetation that was sitting in hollows in the floodplain is hugely greater than the others. So there's a lot of spatial variability in deposition. So we looked for a particular plant community, the classic floodplain meadow with the Great Burnet in this case at Cricklade. We looked at how much phosphorus was available in the soil, both the previous year and how it changed during a year. And then we captured the sediment that fell. We captured the amount going out of the gate in a hay crop, and then inferred how much phosphorus was mobilized within the soil to make the budget balance. And we've done this for a number of sites over a range of years. We're now presenting this data to Natural England because we think meadows are very effective at capturing nutrients, turning them into hay and exporting them out of the river system, which then protects sensitive sites downstream. So this slide is just showing how extensive these meadows once were. This is a river in Sussex, the River Rother, and this is from the tide survey of 1840, where land use was carefully mapped across the whole country, but a group at, I think it's Portsmouth University, did a particular study of the robber and generated this map by translating the tide data into a modern GIS system. And you can see the sinuous river in the middle of the page there. And that green color is the floodplain meadow land use. And you can see virtually the entire floodplain was down to meadow. We have looked more recently at a number of other sites, the Dorset Stour, the Upper Thames, the rivers Severn and Avon, to do a similar study to estimate from the tide map how much of the floodplain was meadow. And I think in all cases, it's the majority, quite often in the order of 70% of the area of the floodplain was managed as meadow. And that seemed to have been the case right up until the 1920s, 1930s, when suddenly artificial fertilizers became available and farmers were able to grow grass for silage or hay wherever they liked on the landscape, because you simply applied fertilizer to the soil. You weren't any longer restricted to the floodplain. And that's when the economic value of floodplain meadows disappeared really very quickly over a 10-year time period. And their biodiversity benefits weren't realized until the 1970s, when they started to be designated as sites for conservation. And so there was that 40 to 50-year gap when they weren't seen as valuable. And we think probably 99% of them disappeared. So they went from being this very extensive land use. You know, our grandparents would probably remember just seeing seas of meadows along rivers in their childhood. And now they're just a few isolated examples dotted around. So not only are the meadows very diverse in terms of their plant composition, as seen above ground, but what's going on below ground is very diverse too. And again, this is natural selection for specializations so that each plant has its own niche. And this links nicely to the hydrological niches we were investigating. So it's the great burnet as the plant furthest right. The black knapweed is another plant that goes down very deep, and a lot of carbon is moving. The estimates are probably a third of all the carbon fixed by photosynthesis gets pumped below ground in grassland, because it's used primarily to feed the mycorrhizal fungi that are doing the nutrient collection for the plants. This was some work done over in the United States. I think this was in Michigan, an area that was once prairie, and various groups are trying to restore prairie grassland. And they did a neat experiment when they had areas that just had a single type of grass, and then another that had 2 species, 4 species, 8 species, and 16 species, and looked at the rate at which carbon was sequestered into the soil. And it follows a very nice pattern that the greater the species richness, the more carbon is captured. Referring back to the earlier diagram, we think that's because when you get a very diverse community, all those species are competing with one another, and they specialize, and some are going down deep and some are occupying the surface. You get much more thorough exploration of the soil by roots. Returning to diversity, this is a field just north of Oxford, which is one of the most diverse. We've recorded with 40 species quite regularly, not only the different herbs, but there could be 15 different species of grass in this picture as well. I'll leave you with our contact details for the partnership, which is an association of all the organizations in the country that have a particular interest in conserving floodplain meadows, where we try to pool our knowledge and resources to sustain some long-term monitoring and study of these systems, and also advocate for their their restoration to try and point out the benefits they can bring. Excuse me. And here is our contact details if anyone wants to get in touch.